We're back, baby. Welcome to the second episode of Critical History. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the mystery of the Crusades. Now, if you missed the first episode, we were discussing the Great Pyramids of Egypt, what Europeans believed their purpose to be, how they were built, and if there's any dispute regarding when they were built. Check it out if you didn't see it. Today, we will be talking about the mystery of the Crusades. Again, we all know the story: brave knights bearing the sign of the cross on their back or on their right shoulder on a sacred quest to reclaim the Holy Land. All the while shouting Deus Vult, naturally. Deus Vult means God's will, or God wills it. And it is also, according to Wikipedia, a far-right dog whistle. Now, where were we? Yes, the Crusades, or more specifically, the mystery of the Crusades. As part of our routine, let's cover the basics. Who, what, when, where, and why. Who? The soldiers, knights, and noblemen from Catholic Europe, as well as Eastern Orthodoxy, modern Germany, France, Turkey, and Armenia. What? A series of medieval religious wars sanctioned by the Church. How many? You might be surprised to hear that according to Wikipedia's classification of what is a crusade, there were 40. You may also be surprised to learn that the term crusades to describe these religious wars only became the popular descriptive term in 1760 AD. Where? Again, depending on if you were able to stay awake during history class or not, you may be hearing for the first time that not all the Crusades even went to the Holy Land. Some were religious wars within Europe, such as the Prussian Crusade and the Lithuanian Crusade. Now, call it a pet peeve of mine, but I can't stand when 50 years of war, such as the Livonian Crusade, the Prussian Crusade, and the Lithuanian Crusade, are called a single war. It just seems a gross oversimplification. When? That would depend on what crusade in particular we're discussing. But broadly, the majority of the Crusades to the Holy Land would fall between 1100 AD and 1300 AD. This is where things get interesting. Why? Hopefully, that's also why you're watching this video. Why were all these religious wars launched? Of interest is how Wikipedia phrases it. The causes of the Crusades in general, and particularly that of the First Crusade, is widely debated among historians. In short, they say it was due to a combination of factors concerning the political situation and tensions between the Muslim and Christian world. Now, what did Crusaders themselves have to say? One of the leaders of the Fourth Crusade of 1202 AD to 1204 AD, Geoffrey de Villehardouin, had this to say, and I quote, "We come on behalf of the high barons of France, who have taken the sign of the cross to avenge the shame done to Jesus Christ, and to reconquer Jerusalem." Quite the omission, Wikipedia. Now you can see what I mean when I say the mystery of the Crusades. Why would the Crusaders wait almost 1200 years after the death of Christ to avenge the shame done to him? One reason could be that the two events actually happened contemporaneously, that is, closer to the same time. Again, drawing on the research done by two Russian mathematicians, Gleb Nusovsky and Anatoly Fomenko, in 2003, they used astronomical methods to calculate that Jesus lived from 1152 AD to 1185 AD. I know what you're thinking. That sounds crazy. Or pseudo-scientific. This is probably a good time to paraphrase one of my favorite quotes. For every complex question, there is a simple answer that's also wrong. That was said by H.L. Mencken. So it's not going to be possible for me to convince you in a few words of this hypothesis. This isn't a question only about why the Crusades occurred or when Jesus lived. The larger issue is whether there are certain mysteries of history that can be cleared up, and specifically if the mystery exists because the chronology that we have assumed our whole lives is correct is in fact erroneous. In other words, stay critical. We'll leave the chronology and come back to that, possibly in a future video. And we'll return to some of the mysteries of the Crusades. Before I get to that, let me take a moment to mention Critical History's sponsor, my first work of historical fiction, which should be available on Amazon as you're watching this. Conquest of Truth. In 1302, following the mysterious death of his father, the Duke of Styria, and grandfather, Rudolph, King of the Romans, Johann, just 12 years old, is forced to flee the Holy Roman Empire. Entrusted with a terrible secret by local Cistercian monks, Johann must solve the murder, become a man, and plot the destruction of his enemies. But for now, it's enough to recognize the possibility that the First Crusade did not necessarily happen before the Fourth Crusade. As I mentioned before, the term Crusades only became the popular term in the late 18th century. So let's take a look at the Fourth Crusade. How did Villehardouin, one of the commanders, refer to it? Well, when he wrote his testament, he called it the Conquest of Constantinople. So on the one hand, they want to reconquer Jerusalem, but they end up conquering Constantinople? That sounds like another mystery to me. Now let me digress for a moment and show a few examples of medieval and ancient maps. These are the so-called T and O maps, Orbis Terrarum, a circle of the lands in Latin. The T is the Mediterranean Ocean, and the O is the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean surrounding the continent of Eurasia and Africa. Now there were various traditions, and the Greeks, for instance, used the island of Delos as the center of the world. And the Eastern Romans used Constantinople. But generally speaking, Jerusalem was considered the center of the world. It is possible that when Villehardouin said he wanted to reconquer Jerusalem, he was in fact talking about Constantinople. That is, the name Jerusalem could have referred to more than one city. Only later did it become solidified to only mean the holy city in current-day Israel. This may seem confusing to people, but you have to realize that a common language, a common alphabet, a common map, and a common calendar are more recent developments in the historical sense. Want another good example of this? In his account of the conquest of Constantinople, Villehardouin refers to a city by the name of Babylon, which we are assured he actually meant Cairo. Another good example would be the different ways letters are pronounced around the world. Japanese famously don't particularly distinguish between L and R. And in Spanish, B and V are pronounced the same, or at least very similarly. You can see how this would lead to confusion, such as, for example, if a person is a Bavarian or a barbarian. Arabic numerals as well were widely adopted in Europe only in the 15th century. Look at modern Arabic numerals as used in the Middle East, and you can see that their number 4 looks like a backwards 3, and their 6 looks like a 7. The same is true of the AD Anno Domini dating system. Apparently, Portugal adopted Anno Domini only in 1422 and Russia in 1700 AD. The chronology we use today with ancient Sumeria, Egypt, Greece, and Rome was only finalized and published in a book, De Doctrina Temporum, by a Jesuit named Dionysius Petavius in 1627 AD. The letter J, to use a further example, was only distinguished from the letter I in English in 1633 AD. If that isn't confusing enough for you, many maps in those days were drawn with either south or east on top. What were we talking about again? Oh yeah, the Fourth Crusade. So the Crusaders conquered Zara on the Adriatic, across from the Italian peninsula, to repay their debts to the Venetians who were transporting them. From there, they headed to Constantinople, where they were able to successfully besiege the city. Let me read a summary of the results of their conquest, siege, and sack. The sack of Constantinople is a major turning point in medieval history. The Crusaders' decision to attack the world's largest Christian city was unprecedented and immediately controversial. Reports of Crusader looting and brutality scandalized and horrified the Orthodox world. Relations between the Catholic and Orthodox churches were catastrophically wounded for many centuries afterwards, and would not be substantially repaired until modern times. The Byzantine Empire was left much poorer, smaller, and ultimately less able to defend itself against the Turkish conquests that followed. The actions of the Crusaders thus directly accelerated the collapse of Christendom in the East, and in the long run facilitated the expansion of Islam into Europe. Now, basically, they didn't so much lay siege to the city as when they arrived and started to lay siege to it, they were able to pressure the Byzantines into appointing a new emperor or co-emperor, Alexios IV, after which they entered the city. After a few months, though, their puppet emperor, Alexios, was deposed by the citizens and later executed. The Crusaders' main encampment was opposite the city on the Golden Horn. And after 2 months of preparation, they started their siege. They were able to capture the northwest corner of the city, and from there they spread out and captured the rest. Churches were looted, citizens were robbed, basically your classic rape and pillage for 3 entire days. The people of Constantinople may have gotten off lightly though. Later medieval tradition dictated that if a siege was successful after citizens had refused to surrender, everyone would be slaughtered. If they surrendered, the city would be pillaged for 3 days. This was a policy that was closely followed by the Mongols in the centuries to come. As a result, the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, was split into the Latin Empire, Empire of Nicaea, Empire of Trebizond, and the Despotate of Epirus. It would not be until 1261 that the Romans, Byzantines, were able to reconquer the city. But that is a story for another day. Now, the reason I call them the Romans, not the Byzantines, is again, they referred to their own empire as Romania, and it was only later scholarly tradition that labeled them as the Byzantines. Back to the topic of the so-called First Crusade. The First Crusade is said to have taken place from 1096 to 1099 AD, and to have successfully captured Jerusalem. One of the central figures of this crusade is known as Peter the Hermit. It was believed until the 19th century that he was the one that came up with the idea for the crusade. Now, these days, Pope Urban gets the credit. This sounds like a mystery to me. Why did historians believe until the 19th century that it was Peter the Hermit that conceived of the crusade? In my humble opinion, this looks more like a question of politics than history. It could be that by the 19th century, some groups wanted to pin the blame for the First Crusade on the Catholic Church. Why do I say that? Well, in the case of the Fourth Crusade, this or the inverse is exactly what happened. Pope Innocent initiated the Fourth Crusade, but later distanced himself from it, threatened participants with excommunication when it became clear that the leadership abandoned a focus on the conquest of the Holy Land and instead intended to sack Christian cities, namely Constantinople. Was this a medieval version of privatizing profits and socializing losses? Taking credit for crusades that go well and blaming others when it doesn't? Back to Peter the Hermit. It is said that already a century later, he had become a legendary figure. What did he do? Well, basically, he recruited peasants and petty nobles in what came to be termed the People's or Peasants' Crusade. It sounds more like a migrant caravan than an army, to use a modern analogy. It is commonly believed that Peter's followers consisted of a massive group of untrained and illiterate peasants who did not even have any idea of where Jerusalem was. This is according to scholars writing in 2004 and 2005. Now, I'm speculating here, but it could be that when the peasants arrived in Constantinople, which the Peasants' Crusade passed through, they thought they had arrived in Jerusalem. This causes modern scholars to accuse them of being illiterate and not knowing where Jerusalem was. When they arrived in Constantinople, they pillaged outside the city in search of supplies and food, leading the Byzantine emperor, also named Alexios, to ferry them across the Bosporus, the strait separating Europe and Asia Minor. Once there, the peasants were decimated by Turkish attacks. Now, very little of this makes sense to me. Why would a group of paupers go on a crusade? What could they hope to have accomplished? It turns out they were classified as paupers, beggars, and in medieval Europe, that made them wards of the church. So to me, it looks like the Catholic Church was trying to move a large mass of beggars from their responsibility to that of the Orthodox Church, which was centered in Constantinople. Keep in mind, Peter is said to have arrived in Constantinople with 30,000 of these paupers. To quote from historical sources, Alexios was less than pleased with their arrival, for along with the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, he was now required to provide for their care and sustenance. After the paupers were massacred, Peter stuck around for a few more years, preaching to the professional crusaders. As for his return to Europe, there is very little concrete record for his life after returning, and much of what we do know is speculation or legend. As if this isn't confusing and speculative enough, I will muddy the waters with one more tidbit. One legend has its roots in the writings of Jacques de Vitry, who found it convenient to convince people from the bishopric of Liege of the merits of participating in the Albigensian Crusade. He did so by manipulating the story of Peter. The Albigensian or Cathar Crusade happened more than 100 years after the First Crusade, and its target? The Cathars of southern France. This crusade lasted over 20 years, and if you see some of their castles, you can see why. Now, to summarize, what was the point of this video? Well, basically, that it can be very difficult to separate fact from fiction, especially when we're talking about events said to have occurred 800 or 900 years ago. To discern what has been added to a story at a later date, what has been left out, or entirely concocted. The point isn't to say that these events didn't happen, but to recognize that there is a confusion over exactly what did happen, and for a number of reasons. These range from political to chronological. In other words, we have to account for the fact that history is written by the victors. Beneficial outcomes are embellished, negative outcomes are omitted, downplayed, or spun. Stay tuned in the next few days as we take a closer look at the mystery of the Mongols. Now, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this episode. God bless, and remember, stay critical.